If we ask Frederick Douglass, he'll tell us it takes something truly extraordinary. It may seem even more incredible than parting the waters of the sea. Then there's Martin Luther King Jr., who said of America, "The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government." In his speech to the sanitation workers in Memphis, he said, "If this nation does not change its ways, it is going to hell." How does one get a nation to give up a culture of white supremacy and racial apartheid? It takes something truly extraordinary. Of course, despite their chafing rebukes of our nation, both Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. are considered two of the greatest and most influential Americans of all time. Yet, like the Hebrew prophets, they were both highly controversial in their own time. Like the prophets, they were seen by many as a threat to the nation and as unpatriotic. So the uproar over Reverend Jeremiah Wright needs to be seen within the context of prophetic religion, both in ancient Israel and in America. And it needs to be understood within the context of the black church in America. Just recently, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice said in a Washington Times interview, quote, "Black Americans were a founding population. Africans and Europeans came here and founded this country together. Europeans by choice, and Africans in chains." End quote. You see, in the founding of this nation, Europeans brought their religion, and Africans were intentionally stripped of theirs. For generations, African slaves were kept from Christianity, and they were divided up so that they wouldn't practice their traditional religions. But when they were finally introduced to Christianity, they were taught by the church that being a slave was ordained by God, and so was respect for one's master. They were taught that they were a people, I need to clear my throat to say this, they were a people cursed by the sins of Ham, the son of Noah. And thus their divine punishment was to be enslaved. And their reward, if they were obedient, would come in the next world. At first, slaves could only attend white churches. This was an arrangement that didn't work out very well for either community. In the minutes from the Presbyterian Synod of South Carolina and Georgia in 1834, it reads, "The gospel, as things are now, can never be preached to the two classes successfully in conjunction. The galleries or the back seats on the lower floors of white churches are generally appropriated to Negroes when it can be done without inconvenience to whites. When it cannot be done conveniently, the Negro must catch the gospel as it escapes through the doors and windows." Of course, black Christians desired more than the white man's convenience would allow. Black Christians wanted places of worship compatible with their own sense of freedom and dignity. However, black churches were considered dangerous and were outlawed in every southern state and were suppressed and severely regulated by law until the Civil War. Before then, black churches met in secret, in swamps and bayous and under the cover of darkness. So black churches emerged in response to white racism. Black Christians created their own churches so that they could meet God on their own terms. Because God, as mediated through the white church's theology, scorned and subjugated them. Just as Moses separated the waters of the sea to lead his people to freedom, black Christians had to separate themselves from white Christians in order to create a path for their own freedom and dignity. They had to separate themselves from a Christian religion that tried to make their dehumanization seem reasonable and inevitable. They had to separate themselves from preachers who would teach them how the Apostle Paul rebuked a slave who wanted to become a Christian to first return to his master. They needed to break free from a church that told black people that their captivity and debasement was ordained by God. And now today, when a proud and powerful black church is on trial in the media, it is imperative for Americans to remember that the black church was born at a time when most white churches were preaching a gospel that was evil in the ways it subjugated and debased non-white people. And in many ways, the black church and black leaders have helped call Christianity back toward the truth and the light that all people are children of God. We have to remember that black churches affirmed black people as human and beloved at a time when society told them they were nobody. And it was the only public institution where black people had total authority for a long time. It was the only place in society where a black person was not just seen as someone's servant, janitor, or maid, but was seen as a blessed child of God. Scholar Eric Lincoln writes of the importance of the black church in that it became the community forum, the public school, the conservatory of music, the place where the elocutionary arts and graphic arts and literary arts and the domestic arts were put on proud display. It was the lyceum and gymnasium as well as the sanctum sanctorum. It was the prime developer of black leadership. One historian wrote, "It became to the Afro-American race what Faneuil Hall was to the Anglo-American, the cradle of liberty." It produced Nat Turner, and it produced Martin Luther King Jr. The black church has been a womb and a mother to the vast spectrum of black leadership in every generation since its inception. And it's important to note, as Lincoln does, that during the slave era, the black churches were monitored by the white men and not infrequently closed or destroyed. If he considered them a threat to his interests or well-being, they were shut down. And it feels like they're being monitored again today, as sound bites are being compiled and used for character assassination against a prominent black preacher. The message to all black preachers is, we're watching you. Watch what you say, because we're going to take it out of context if we have to and broadcast it to the world in order to discredit and demean you, and in order to demean the members of your church, including popular political figures. And that's why I'm preaching this sermon today. Because it's become clear that the majority of people in our country have no idea about the importance and the role the black church and the prophetic tradition have played in advancing the American ideals of democracy. Not just in advancing the interests and ideals of black Americans, but the interests and ideals of all Americans. And that's why the black church had to separate itself. Like Moses separated the waters of the Red Sea, because it took something that extraordinary to lead all of us and our nation out of captivity. But the story doesn't end with Moses parting the waters. And the work isn't over yet for us. Moses lifted his hand a second time after the people were free, and the waters rushed back together and swallowed the powerful forces of Pharaoh that were oppressing them. Ultimately, if racism in this country is to become a thing of the past, it will require black people and white people and people of all colors, hues, and ethnicities to feel at home together in work, in worship, and everywhere. In other words, the only way we're going to permanently drown the evil forces of racism will be for our communities to truly unite as one human race.